Well, good afternoon. Again, for those of you that have just joined, my name is Ron Hill, and I'm with RightStar Systems. And today we will be covering what's new within BMC Service Desk Express with Alignability version 10.1. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to attend the presentation. This release has been we have been waiting on this for quite some time, and I got to say it's actually one of the more exciting releases within the alignability process model. So hopefully you'll find some of the things that we're going to be covering today useful and in your alignability implementation. So today, in terms of our agenda, we're going to be covering what's new with the actual process model itself, and the processes and new functionality. And then we're going to cover from the application perspective what's new within the product, and then talk about a little bit about what specifically the Service Pack 1 introduced to version 10.1. So that also is a relatively new release there. And then in addition to that, notes regarding how to upgrade, things of that nature. So that's more or less our agenda for today. At the moment, I do have if you'd like to ask questions, all the lines are muted, so if you'd like to ask questions, please type those in the chat session, and towards the end of the presentation, I'll be glad to answer those chats. And in addition to that, we might even open up the lines for conversation if time allows. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So in terms of the alignability process model, some of the new things that have been introduced, one of which is the introduction to the idle v3 concepts. And with that, we've also changed the user interface of at least the launch page or the home page for the documentation. We've also renamed incident management to request management, and that's to allow for the new processes related to request fulfillment. In addition to that, we have service catalog. The service catalog has been updated in terms of its functionality again, so we're going to cover more of these in detail, as well as introduced complements to the procedures in request management. And as I mentioned before, request fulfillment was also introduced. In addition to that, we've had some slight definition changes as it relates to the process model. So in terms of what is classified as a change and versus request fulfillment, so we had to make some adjustments there. And then also we had some minor updates in terms of terminology. One last thing is also the major incident procedures in request management. So with that, let's cover this in a little bit more detail. Again, with the APM documentation, what you're seeing here is the actual front page. And again, this has definitely more of an idle v3 look and feel, but also the terminology is reflected as well. So this takes the place of the current homepage that most of you have, or that all of you have today, with the navy or purple boxes that are on that front page. This is where you'd actually launch into the individual processes. So in terms of the service catalog, one of the first things that was introduced was the concept of a parent-child relationship. And this really comes into play when you start talking about service infrastructures. And so I'll talk more about that here in a moment. So in terms of a service infrastructure, where this is applicable is if, for example, let's take email as a service as an example. If we had a North American implementation of an email system and then a European implementation of email, those are two distinct service infrastructures. And so by establishing one, a parent, and then the child services as service infrastructures, it makes it much easier in terms of reporting when you talk about your service level agreements. Because certainly if the North American infrastructure goes down, we do not want to be penalized for our SLA for the European customers that might be using the European infrastructure. So that's just one example of how you might use this parent-child and service instance and infrastructure capability. Another feature that was added was because of the major incident processes, we also introduced a major incident team tab. So at this point, you can identify individuals that are key to the to that particular service if there were a major incident for that. So as I mentioned before, the incident management, we've changed that terminology now to request management, and one of the primary reasons is because of the request fulfillment processes. But in addition to that, we also introduced the complement and complaint handling. Well, we actually introduced the complaint or complement handling. So IDLE v3 says that we should not only allow for complaints, but we should also allow for compliments that customers might want to make. So those processes and terminology have been added. In terms of the request fulfillment, so first of all, what exactly is a request for fulfillment? And these are the specific processes that were introduced. And so in alignability, we define a request for fulfillment as a request that can be handled by request fulfillment when it can be implemented by the following the workflow defined in a support request template, and that has been approved by the service owner, and this template was used to create the support request. So for those of you that have been wanting the ability to have work orders and link those work orders to your support request, this is exactly what this is for. This what allows you to do that. And specifically, request fulfillment allows us to handle common requests that really should not have to go through a formal change process. And a perfect example of this would be a new hire scenario. Yes, we are making changes to the infrastructure, but it would be overkill to try to take the new hire process through the full-blown formal change process. So that's one of the things that was introduced in IDLE v3, and as a result, we absolutely saw a need for this in alignability and introduced that as well. Going back to the processes themselves, I mentioned the fact that work orders can be linked to the support request now. One, that is something that should be reserved explicitly for a support request that's categorized as request fulfillment. But I should also stress that not all request fulfillment support requests have to have a work order. A good example of that would be if a customer were asking simply a question of the service desk, nothing was broken, it's not a true incident, it's not a break-fix scenario, they're just requesting service of sorts. So again, request fulfillment, one of the new processes that was introduced in version 10.1. Another process that was introduced was the concept of a major incident. So it's very often that we have scenarios where a major service or a core service is down for some reason or another, and it's really more involved than just simply assigning it to a single technician. Typically, when these types of core services go down, there's typically a team of individuals that represent different disciplines of IT, such as the network, the database team, the applications team, will commonly convene and put their heads together to try to figure out the best way to resolve that incident as quickly as possible. And that's exactly what the major incident does for us. So in Procedures 1.1 in request management, Typically, you're accustomed to identifying the impact. Well, we've added these two additional boxes here. So one, if the impact is major, being that the core or critical service is down, then at that point we would escalate that to a given service owner. At that point, the service owner would have the ability to assemble the major incident team and go through resolution. This is another screenshot of the actual service form, and here you can see the major incident tab that's listed here, and with that, in this case, we have Bob Stock as the only member of this major incident team. And so simply by just adding as many staff members as you wish, they're a part of that major incident team for that given service. So that is that is defined on a per service basis, the major incident team. Okay, moving on. So what's new within the application? So those are all changes that have been made from a process perspective. Now let's look at the changes that were made to the actual application. So first and foremost, we're taking advantage of the new user interface in Service Desk Express version 10.1. So we'll be looking at that here in just a moment if you haven't already seen that. In addition to that, we revised the architecture from the role-based permissions. So this is something that is quite a bit of a change in terms of how you define roles and assign roles to individuals. And in short, the main reason that this was done was to eliminate the math statements so that we can improve the performance of the client-side business rules. And also, I think it's much easier to create client-side business rules where you take roles into account. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually switch over to my alignability implementation, and let's take a look here. So if we go to So if we look at the application, first of all, you'll notice that this is significantly different from previous versions of Service Desk Express in terms of the UI. So again, this is functionality that was introduced as part of Service Desk Express 10.1. If we expand the workspaces, here is our navigation bar that's collapsible. And then if we look here at the top, I've got a number of items that are open in a tab format. So for those of you that maybe have not seen version 10.1, one of the major purposes and objectives of 10.1 was to flatten the user interface, minimize the number of Internet Explorer windows that you might have open at any given time. So let's take a look at some of these roles. So first of all, there was a new form was created. It's the role form, and this allows us to identify the role. Here is an example of the specialist role that you probably are all familiar with, should be, and a description of that. So very simple form in terms of what content is here. You'll notice the tab at the bottom where we can see all the individuals that have that role. Here again, if you've not seen some of the later versions of Service Desk Express, if we can expand and collapse the tabs at the bottom, so that's a nice feature. If we don't want to see that at all, we can even minimize that. So, but again, here's all the individuals that have this particular role assigned to them. And the action button allows us to assign or unassign and edit any details for those relationships. So a new form here in terms of the role. Now, if we look at the support staff form, and this has also been a change, whereas before this form was referred to as a member form, the creators of Alignability, they actually went back to the BMC terminology, so it is now back to a staff form. But in your member or staff form, in your current versions, you have a list of all of the roles, and you have check boxes next to those. And then client-side business rules were created to allow or deny access or certain functionality within the form based upon that. Well, that's no longer the case.